Victimhood as a weapon to win, not with facts. We're constantly surrounded by conversations that start simple, but quickly turn into something much more intense, whether it's chatting with a partner about shared responsibilities at home, debating with colleagues over the best way to tackle a team challenge at work, or even engaging in broader discussions about how communities and systems should operate fairly for everyone involved. I've been thinking a lot lately about the hidden dynamics that decide who comes out ahead in these exchanges, and it turns out it's not always the person with the strongest facts or the clearest reasoning. Today, I want to explore a strategy that's as old as human interaction itself, one where people win not by building a case with logic and evidence, but by seizing control through emotions, moral judgments, accusations, and claims that never really need to be proven. It's an approach that shifts the entire battlefield, and once you see it, you start noticing it everywhere, from personal relationships to public debates about equality, opportunity, and what kind of world we want to build. Before we get too deep, let me paint a quick picture to set the stage without spoiling all the details. Imagine someone opens up about feeling frustrated with modern life. Maybe they're single and struggling to connect, or they're pointing out imbalances in how responsibilities and expectations land unevenly between people. You might expect a thoughtful exchange of ideas or even some shared stories, but instead the response comes in hot, not addressing the points raised, but attacking the very character of the person speaking or those who agree with them. It's framed as concern or truth-telling, but really it's a way of positioning one side as evolved and virtuous while painting the other as defective or stuck. This kind of pivot happens so smoothly that the original issue gets lost, and suddenly the conversation is about who's morally right rather than what's actually true. If that rings a bell, or if you've ever walked away from a talk feeling like you lost ground even though your points made sense, stick with me, because we're about to break down exactly how this plays out and why it's so effective. If any part of this discussion resonates with you, perhaps through a compelling insight or a moment of clear recognition, please consider liking the episode, leaving a comment, and sharing it with others. And be sure to follow for future explorations. Now let's pull back the curtain on the full picture, because this isn't just a one-off tactic, it's a structured way of engaging that turns arguments into moral battlegrounds. At its core, the strategy begins by assuming the moral high ground as an unquestioned fact right from the opening line. The person doesn't explain why their view represents justice or fairness, they simply speak as if it's obvious and anyone decent would already agree. When pushback arrives, whether it's data, personal experiences, or logical questions, the response isn't to engage those points head-on. Instead, disagreement gets reframed instantly as proof of a deeper flaw in the other person. Maybe they're immature, lacking emotional skills, driven by ego, or simply blind to some obvious reality. The opponent's position gets personalized as coming from toxicity or self-interest, while the accuser's stance is universalized as representing pure morality and the greater good for everyone. Victimhood gets monopolized to one side, claims all the suffering and evolution while conceding none to the other. Even if real struggles exist on both ends, they're dismissed or blamed on the opponent's own choices. And the masterstroke is presenting the whole narrative as the neutral default, the boring, obvious truth of the world, not some selective interpretation worth debating. Any challenge to it gets treated as naive or missing the point entirely. You see this dynamic unfold in all sorts of settings. Think about family talks where one person vents about feeling overwhelmed and the reply isn't empathy or solutions, but a lecture on how they're the real problem for not evolving faster, or in workplace disputes where feedback on processes turns into character assassination about who's more committed or ethical. It even shows up in larger conversations about balancing individual freedom with collective responsibilities, where one side claims moral authority over progress while labeling the other as regressive without ever needing to prove the long-term outcomes. What makes this approach so potent isn't mystery, it's deeply rooted in how our minds actually work. For centuries, thinkers have noted that human persuasion relies on three main pillars: credibility, logic, and emotion, but time and again evidence shows that emotion carries the heaviest weight, especially in the heat of the moment. Pure reasoning appeals to our rational side, sure, but emotions create the motivation and the lasting memory that sticks with people long after facts fade. Studies in psychology back this up, showing that when arguments tap into feelings of shame, outrage, or moral superiority, they boost engagement and make the message far more memorable than dry data alone. People don't decide based on spreadsheets. In most cases, they decide based on how something feels right or wrong in their gut, and once that emotional frame locks in, it's incredibly hard to break with logic, because defending yourself now feels like proving you're not a bad person rather than exploring truth. This is where moral grandstanding comes in, the use of lofty ethical talk not to seek understanding but to boost status and impress others or dominate the room. It turns discourse into a performance where the grandstander signals their own virtue while freezing the opponent in a defensive spot. The result is polarization, because no one wants to look morally defective, so they either retreat or mirror the tactic, escalating the whole thing. In relationships, this can erode trust, turning partners into adversaries. At work, it stalls collaboration because ideas get judged by who seems more righteous instead of what works best. And in broader societal talks about free market systems versus more centralized Marxist or communist approaches or authority-oriented structures, it shuts down nuance, making compromise feel like betrayal. Think about the architecture in action step by step. First, the moral position is assumed, never argued for, as if it's the air we breathe. Next, any counter gets reframed not as a valid point but as evidence of the speaker's personal failing. Why else would they disagree unless something's wrong with them? The opponent's view gets tied to ego or hidden motives, while the grandstanders represents universal justice. Victimhood stays firmly in one camp, even suffering on the other side gets twisted as self-inflicted or irrelevant. Finally, the selective story becomes the default reality, presented as neutral and obvious, so challenging it marks you as out of touch. This isn't about winning hearts through shared truth, it's about controlling the frame so the other side spends all their energy justifying why they're not defective. And here's the kicker: research shows this works because emotions linger far longer than facts in memory, while logic without emotional buy-in often falls flat. Ridicule and shaming amplify it too, because nothing disarms faster than making someone feel small or judged by the group. Historically, similar patterns appear in power struggles where the goal was never pure reason but mobilizing loyalty through moral outrage and the sense of being on the right side of history. To bring this home, let's reflect on a few key observations that capture the essence. One that stands out is how the tactic treats every sentence as a judgment rather than an invitation to reason, as if the speaker is the arbiter of right and wrong and disagreement proves moral weakness. Another highlights the difference in styles, where one side keeps appealing to explain and make sense while the other positions itself above it all, declaring you're simply bad or out of step with everyone decent. Then there's the insight that logic won't win if the game is rigged from the start with assumed moral victory, because facts rarely resolve a character attack. And finally, the recognition that this approach feels manipulative and lacking integrity, yet it's smart in its effectiveness because it forces the opponent into defense while the accuser claims the ethical throne without ever proving a thing. So what can we do about it if we want to defend ourselves or even turn the tide without losing our own integrity? The first step is awareness, recognizing the frame shift when it happens instead of walking right into the trap. Don't get pulled into justifying, arguing, defending, or explaining on their moral terms, because as soon as you do, you've accepted their role as judge. Stay calm and call out the tactic neutrally. Something like that's moving to personal judgment instead of addressing the actual points raised or what evidence would actually change your view here. This exposes the lack of substance without escalating emotionally. Build your own credibility through consistent actions and calm reasoning, showing you're not the defective character they're painting. For longer-term wins, combine approaches. Start with shared emotional ground to lower defenses, then layer in clear logic and evidence, because pure reason alone rarely persuades, but a hybrid creates real change. And in moments of real exploitation where you're being shamed unfairly, it can be powerful to mirror the strategy, selectively claim the moral high ground yourself with righteous judgment, forcing them to justify their position. How can you support an idea that ignores real harms to so many or dismisses basic fairness for everyone involved? It feels unnatural at first, almost dirty, because it goes against straightforward logic, but it levels the playing field and creates the social cost that might make someone pause and actually listen next time. The key is using it sparingly with integrity, never as your default, because the real strength comes from holding on to truth-seeking while understanding the emotional battlefield. At the end of the day, the smartest path isn't always winning every single clash, it's choosing battles wisely and fostering discourse that values evidence over grandstanding. When we learn these patterns, we protect ourselves from manipulation and maybe even guide conversations back toward mutual respect and real solutions. Whether in your closest relationships, your professional life, or the wider talks shaping our world, seeing the strategy for what it is gives you the power to respond with clarity and strength. Thanks for spending this time with me. I hope it sparks some reflection in your own interactions. Until next time, keep questioning, keep reasoning, and above all, keep striving for understanding in a world that often rewards the loudest moral claim instead of the clearest truth. Stay afloat, stay free,